Um, okay. Morning. So we're in the middle of page 605. Before we begin, though, just to remind ourselves where we're holding. Before we do, no, I think some of you for sure haven't heard me say it, and even if you have, it won't hurt to hear it again. I know it's not Rosh Hashanah now. Shavuos is coming up, but
We're starting early.
in our machzor, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in the morning prayer, there's a certain point when the chazan starts to chazan away. So let's say for the first half hour, the first 20 minutes, we do the regular prayers we do every Shabbos, every morning, every Shabbos morning. And then we get to a certain section, and there's a bold word in the machzor, and the chazan calls it out, and has a whole song. You know which word? No, that's before Musaf.
Oh, that's what I was thinking. Oh,
Yeah. Hamelach. Hamelach, the king, is seated upon a lofty and sublime throne. Now, this is different than what we say every other Shabbos. Every other Shabbos, we say Hamelach Hayoshev, the king who sits on a sublime throne. On Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we say Hamelach Yoshev, the king is seated, is sitting, present tense, on sublime throne. Now, in the Chabad Machzor, I don't know if it appears in any other Machzor. I assume not. But in the Chabad Machzor, the Alter Rebbe put in the following story. There's no other story in the Machzor and the Siddur that I know of. It is quoted in the Machzorim that on one occasion, when the holy rabbi, Rab Aaron of Karlin of blessed memory, he was one of the eminent disciples of the Maggid of Mezrich. So he was a colleague of the Alter Rebbe. So on one occasion, when he began to recite Hamelach, he fell into a deep faint. He fainted. When later asked the cause for this, why did he faint? He replied that he reflected upon the statement in the Talmud. The Talmud tells the story during the right before the destruction of the Second Temple, when the Romans laid siege on Jerusalem. So there was great debate inside Jerusalem between the rabbis and, remember what they were called? The Biryonim, loosely translated as hooligans. They were the younger faction that wanted to fight the Romans. The rabbis, the elders, those who, the Sanhedrin, the rabbis of the time wanted to make peace with the Romans, even though that would probably mean the destruction of the temple. At least, maybe Jerusalem, the Israel wouldn't be destroyed, the Jews wouldn't be sent into exile, some sort of peace treaty. And the Biryonim wanted to fight. They wanted to, and Jerusalem had enough food and enough supplies to last for 3 years. So there was a lot of fighting going on inside. Should we submit or not? And during that time, the Biryonim burnt down all the storehouses so that the rabbis would be forced to come to some sort of term and agree to them. And they also protected the walls of the city from the inside, not to let anyone go out to try to broker a deal with the Romans for surrender. So the Romans were laying siege on the city from the outside, and the Biryonim were laying siege on the city from the inside.
Oh, great.
But there was one opportunity for people to get out of the city, and that was, it's biblically forbidden to bury a body in Jerusalem, besides for King David and his descendants. So whenever someone died, their coffin had to be carried out of the city. So the Biryonim had to let him out. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the head. He was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time. I don't even know if he was that. He was the leading rabbi of the time. His nephew was one of the head Bir Yoinim, and it got to a point where him and his nephew decided they had to get him out to try to figure out what to do to make some sort of deal with the Romans. So the plan was that they would play his death, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai died. He'd be carried out in a coffin, and once he was out of the city, he would go to the Roman general as a representative of the Jewish people to broker a deal. When they got to the city, the B'yonim were a little suspicious. They wanted to take swords and stab the coffin to make sure the body was actually dead. But luckily, the people carrying the coffin managed to avoid that by saying, "What would the Romans think when you are stabbing the coffin of your own rabbi?" Anyhow, they managed to avoid it, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai got out. Went to the general. He greeted the general as the king. Vespasian, yeah. He greeted him as Your Majesty. So Vespasian said, "I should kill you." Why? Because if I'm the king, if I'm not the king, then you just committed treason. You gave me the honor of the king while there is a king. And if I am the king, why are you only coming now? Where have you been till now? And at that moment, someone came running in saying that they just got notice that the king in Rome had died, and he was appointed as the next king.
Oh, wow.
The whole story, how in that moment one shoe was on, one shoe was off. And the shoe that he was wearing, he couldn't take off, and the shoe that he had off, he couldn't put on, because when you hear good news, just like when you get hot, when the body warms up, right? If you're wearing a ring, those who wear rings, you'll know when your body temperature rises, sometimes you can't get the ring off. It swells. So it says Shmua Tova Tadashin, some good news makes the bones grow. So literally that. Anyway, he managed. He was so impressed by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He asked him for what do you want? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said he should leave Yavne and its sages. Yavne is the city that the Sanhedrin had moved to. He should spare Yavne and the sages. In other words, the seat of Torah study. The rabbis were very upset at him at the time. Why didn't you save the temple? Save Jerusalem. But as generations went on, people realized they would have never given him that. And besides, 2,000 years later, we know the reason Judaism is still alive is because the Torah was preserved. Anyhow, getting back to the story, so Aaron of Karlin responded, quoting this, reflecting about. He said, "Why did he faint?" He reflected upon the statement in the Talmud. The Talmud says, "If I am a king, why did you not come before?" In other words, he reads this word, "The king is seated upon the lofty and sublime throne." When he realizes the king, he fainted. Because, why are you showing up now on Rosh Hashanah? Where were you until now? And the Machzor concludes, if the holy Rebbe Aaron felt so, how should we feel? We don't even feel that worry. We don't even feel that shame. What are we doing here? And this is a call to get focused. And we learned about it 4 months before. Now we have 4 months to prepare ourselves. But the question still stands, do you know anyone that has fainted when saying Hamelach? Could you imagine yourself fainting, even if you spent 4 months meditating on this? Could you imagine yourself getting up on Rosh Hashanah, hearing the word Hamelach and fainting? Not quite. Yeah? Pretty distant. So we learned last week, we started off chapter 41, that the premise of the foundation of divine service is fear. Fear and acceptance of the yoke. Fear of God, the lowest level of fear, just accepting the yoke of heaven. And we gave some sort of meditation to get us there. One is that God is, right, the meditation you can have every day, that God is always present. This awesome, lofty God cares about what I'm doing right now, me the nothing, cares about what I'm doing, and he's present watching my every action. Then, when I'm doing a mitzvah, there's a general divine light that's present, because I am God's hand, right? Performing the mitzvah, bringing godliness into the world. And then we discussed even every specific mitzvah has an additional divine energy. We discussed tefillin, right? The different parts, the different parshias of tefillin, and then the talis being wrapped, all in experiencing God's presence while doing the mitzvah. So tomorrow morning, if you have all of these thoughts, can you imagine, do you think that you might suddenly, your heart might start beating faster in awe of God? Maybe yeah, maybe not. Some days yes, some days no. So the Alter Rebbe is going to right now address the question that some may have, either always or sometimes. Let's say I try all of this. Let's say I have all these meditations. If at the end of the day, my heart doesn't beat faster, in other words, I'm not emotionally more afraid of God, afraid, again, not in the monster type of way, in awe, but in awe that creates an actual fear, an actual quicker heart rate, then what's it all worth? In other words, why do I want emotions to act as wings to elevate the mitzvahs? Let's say I have all of these meditations, my emotions aren't awakened. In my mind, I understand I should be fearful. In my mind, I might be in awe of God. But in my heart, I'm not. Some people just aren't very emotional, or even if they are emotional, it's not easy. Even people that can once in a while, their heart beats faster when they're going to see their spouse or their kids. Not every time. Yeah. So remember, the Alter Rebbe and Tanya is trying to tell us how this is very close to us, to be in our hearts, that we can actually feel. Ask the average person, it's not so close. Even someone that tries very hard. So is there a point in all of this meditation if it doesn't necessarily lead to actual emotion? Okay. So let's look, because remember, we were saying, the Alter Rebbe was saying every day you should spend time meditating. Will it lead to emotions every day? Not necessarily. So what's the point?
Is there a difference between praying and meditating? Or is it really all one thing?
Can the answer be both?
Yes, because meditating, I don't think of praying. Whenever I've tried to do, I never could meditate. You're supposed to make your mind go blank.
No. That's not meditation. That might be some sort of Eastern. That's not what the word meditation means. What does the word meditation mean? What does the word meditate mean? To focus on something. Okay, so there's, and a lot of these meditations that exist in the world, a lot of these things are not necessarily kosher. I'm not a rabbi that's knowledgeable enough, but I know that a lot of these Eastern meditations are for sure based on idolatry, may even have some idolatrous part, certain words you're supposed to think about and certain be problematic. When we use the term meditate, what we mean is to contemplate, to think deeply, to think in a focused way about the things the Alter Rebbe is telling us to focus on, to think about God primarily.
Go back, we were saying by adding the kavanah and raising the kavanah of it, that intensifies the prayers and makes it.
So in other words, the meditation is like the kavanah. So it's two elements of the same thing. But again, there's a mitzvah to pray. If I just meditate, did I fulfill the mitzvah of prayer? No. If I prayed, I fulfilled the mitzvah. But did I meditate? Did it have wings? Did it have emotions? No. So they're both necessary components, one more necessary than the other. The words of prayer are more necessary than the meditation. Just by divine providence, today, every day we learn a lot of daily studies you have in your app. Today, every day we learn Hayom Yom. Hayom Yom is a Hasidic saying that the Rebbe compiled, a saying for every day, either a saying or a custom. Today's Hayom Yom reads as follows, just because you asked the question. Let me get the English here so I can read it in English without. Here we go. The beginning No, it's frozen. Oh. The beginning of one's decline, God save us, is the lack of service in prayer. What does prayer mean without service? Everything becomes dry and cold. You're just saying the words. Even a mitzvah performed by habit becomes burdensome. Everything is rushed. One loses the sense of pleasure in Torah study. The atmosphere itself becomes crass. Needless to say, one is totally incapable of influencing others. So how do you reverse all of these things to have an enjoyment and a passion about performing a mitzvah, to have a sense of pleasure in Torah study, to become more warm and be able to influence others? Through service and prayer. What's service and prayer? We're talking about meditation that leads to emotion. So that when we pray, what's prayer? Prayer is talking to God. When we communicate with God, we're doing it with emotion. We're feeling, we're there. What if you spent all this time meditating? You didn't get there. What do? So let's see in the middle of 605, the third paragraph. In such a case, in other words, in a case where you meditated about general meditation and then the specific mitzvah meditation, in other words, having contemplated this matter, then even though after all this meditation, no dread or fear descends upon him in a manifest manner in his heart, nevertheless, since he accepts the kingdom of heaven upon himself and draws upon himself the fear of him in his conscious thought and rational volition, and this submission to God and his fear of him is beyond a doubt a sincere one, for it is the nature of all Jewish souls not to rebel against the blessed holy king. Yeah. So he has what we said last week is sort of a connection to fear. He has the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, even though he doesn't have a palpable fear. Then the Torah he studies or the commandments he performs, because of his submission to the heavenly yoke and because of the fear that he has drawn, not into his heart, because he doesn't feel the fear, but into his mind. So he has a fear in his mind. We'll see in a moment what that might mean. So are termed complete service of the kind that can result only from a fear of God, as the Alter Rebbe soon goes on to say. Like all service performed by a servant for his master or king, which is, of course, prompted by fear and awe. In other words, even if you didn't actually create an awe or fear of Hashem, but because you meditated, you contemplated, and therefore, at least in your mind, you created this awe and fear, it's considered as if you serve God in prayer. Even though technically you don't have the wings, because there was no emotion, there was no fear that made the wings flap. We'll soon see. We saw an instance where there was a tzaddik that was so fearful of God that he fainted. Yeah. There are many other stories of tzaddikim that were so in love with God, so to speak, they were dancing. Yeah. The famous story I always like to share about the two brothers, Rabbi Elimelech and Rabbi Zusha, that were in prison, and they couldn't pray because of the pail. And when the guard heard that they were dancing because now they could fulfill God's request of not praying when there's a pail of waste in the middle of the room. The guard took it out, so they davened. In other words, they were so happy to the point of dancing. That was an expression of love. It wasn't an external thing. It was an expression of a deep love with God. Which story would you relate to more? The tzaddik. Two questions. Which story would you relate to more? In other words, if you saw these two tzaddikim, who would you want to go to? But also, what do you feel more of a personal connection with? Or where do you see yourself being more successful? In the column of fear or in the column of love? And it could be two different answers for both questions. It could be you drawn to one because it's not your nature, because it's the opposite of your nature. You want to experience it.
I think that the fear side, because this might sound really goofy, but the morning prayers, where it's like God's protecting you against all these different things, the section I'm talking about. Okay, all these different things that could happen to you, unnatural death and all these, tons of things. It's almost like if I don't do my morning prayer, I get this chill, like something's going to happen. So I don't know if that's the right kind of fear or not.
Okay, but that's something you've experienced.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get there, and hopefully we'll grow because there are many levels in fear. Hopefully, the fear, let's say you say of a child is different than the fear of an adult. Okay, so there's levels to grow. But it seems like as of now, what you identify more with is the side of fear.
Right.
Okay. So we mentioned that fear and accepting of the yoke of heaven is sort of the same. It is the same kind. But are they really the same? Is it possible to have fear without acceptance of yoke, or the acceptance of the yoke of heaven without fear? Before we get there, last week we established at the beginning of the chapter that although we need both love and fear, because can a bird fly with one wing? No, we have two wings. One is love, one is fear. So we need both. And although a bird can't fly with one, which one comes first? Remember love or fear? Well, that's what we would like to come first. But Al Rebbe said that as a foundation, as a basic premise, you need fear. Why? Because without fear, which is connected to acceptance of yoke, then you may never get to love. Because when you're in love, you can justify not necessarily doing what you're supposed to do. Yeah? Okay, so we know the fact. We need fear first. But why? Right? We said Nasav and Ishma. Right? We're going to understand. Why does fear come first? And the simple answer is when you have two people that are in love, or two people that are sort of equal, yeah, then love is probably more necessary. Right? If you have two people that are equal, you want love to be the foundation. Because when there's fear involved, now one is on top of the other. So you want love to be the foundation. Eventually, you want an element of fear that the person is ashamed to do something wrong, etc. But you want the foundation. But when you have a hierarchy, when you have one on top of the other, then you want fear to be the foundation. The basic example is a military. In a military, although you want the soldiers to love their country enough to be willing to give up their life for it, but if the foundation is love, you have no army. The foundation has to be discipline. What are you taught in the army? You're not taught to love your country. Well, maybe eventually you are, but in the training, in basic training, you're taught to be disciplined, to do what you're told to do. By the way, when the Rebbe in 1980, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, an organization, a children's organization called Tzivot Hashem, the Army of Hashem. It's an organization that Rebbe started in 1980. And growing up, I was part of it. My kids are part of it. There are hundreds of thousands of Jewish kids around the world that are part of it. Now it's already more streamlined online, but it used to be every holiday there were missions you had to do for the holiday, and you'd fill it in, and your parents would sign it and send it in, and you get ranks. There'd be ranks. You started off as a private and become a captain, a lieutenant, whatever. You go up in ranks, and you could technically become a general. The only condition, the terms of being a member was you had to be under bar bat mitzvah.
Under?
Yeah. It was only for children, under bar bat mitzvah. Now, for those of you who know us a little, you'll know that we're pretty picky about the gifts people give us, the kids specifically, because we're sort of fixated on only having kosher images around the children, kosher pictures and kosher ideas, etc. And a lot of the Rebbe's focus was around making the environment, especially around children, as pure as possible. So when the Rebbe came out with this organization, when the Rebbe founded this organization, called it Tzivos Hashem, the Army of Hashem, and made all these ranks as if you're in an army, people asked the Rebbe, why did this seems like not the right positive environment you want children to be around? The Rebbe addressed this at a public gathering. The Rebbe said he was asked the question, why did he go this route of an army? And the Rebbe said he thought about it for a long time, and he came to the conclusion that this is exactly what the youth today are missing. The youth today are missing the discipline. They're missing the feeling that there's a boss on top of them, that there's someone that there's something that they can't just do what they feel like doing, what they want to do. That's what's missing in the youth today. And even though perhaps it has like a negative connotation being in an army, but this would be very helpful for the general preservation, so to speak, of Yiddishkeit. But in an army, you see that fear is the basic foundation. When you look at what we learned in Tanya up until now, we learned many times that in order for God to reside, to rest within the person, the first condition is that the person can't be too big of an ego. He can't be too egotistical. He has to have bittul, right? A little bit of you have to make a little space, right? A full cup, you can't add anything inside of it because it's full already. If there's a little empty space, then God can rest there. Where is there more empty space? In a person that feels is more feeling fear or love? Usually love, a person says, I'm full of love.
Yeah,
Why do you love someone or something? Usually because it makes you feel good, because it benefits you in some way. Even the most primal love to your children. Why do you love them? Okay, you may not be able to describe it, but at the end of the day, why do you love them? Because they're me, they're part of me, they're an extension of me. There's something there's something selfish. So even when someone loves God, there's some selfish element to it. Not, again, selfish is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not a bittul, it's not a nullification of self. It's not a removal of self. If a person serves God purely out of love, then there's a chance that they might, drive to shul on Yom Kippur. Why? Because they want to go to shul to daven to God. They love God so much. If there's no element of awe, of fear, there's nothing stopping them from doing that. Why? Again, because love is about feeling the self, whereas fear is not about me. On the contrary, the less of me, the less I have to fear. In other words, not the less, the more I focus on what the other wants, the less reason I have to be scared of a negative result in the end. So why do we need love? If fear is enough to get me to do what the other person wants, to do what God wants, to be an obedient Jew, to be an observant Jew, I need fear. Why do I need love? That's obvious too, because what happens when you just do things out of fear? You stop wanting to do them. You stop having an excitement in doing them, and it gets dry and it gets stale. We want to do things, we want to do mitzvahs with excitement out of love. But the love can't be the foundation. The foundation has to be the fear. Yeah? It's like the two, and by the way, we Jews are referred to by God as both children and servants. On Rosh Hashanah, we sing a song after we blow the shofar during the Musaf, im kevanim, im, if we're like children or if we're like servants. We say Avinu, Malkeinu, our father. In other words, we're children. Malkeinu, we're subjects. We're servants. So which one are we? We're both. What's the difference? What's the difference between a child and a servant?
Bnei Israel was always children, and they were slaves to Pharaoh, but when they were freed, they became servants to God.
And what's the word? What does it say? Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim avadai heim. To me, the children of Israel are servants. So they're children and servants at the same time. Children, the relationship between a child and a father is one that's founded. The foundation is love. The foundation of the relationship between a servant and his master is fear. Right? That's why a servant, halachically, if a servant belongs to the master. So what happens if the servant is walking down the street and he finds $100 bill? So if you're walking down the street and you find a $100 bill, you can keep it. What happens if a servant finds a $100 bill?
Gives it to master.
Doesn't give it. It belongs to the master. It doesn't belong to him because he belongs to the master. In other words, where do we see bittul more? Where do we see the removal of self more? Where do we see less of the self? In a servant. But we need both. We're both. We need love also. That's why God coins us as children. Let's see. So in the middle of 606, yeah? On the other hand, what's on the other hand? In other words, we're saying till now that if you have fear, even if you don't have the emotion of fear, but you meditated and you have fear in your mind, that's considered service of God, right? On the other hand, if one studies Torah and performs a commandment with love alone, as now Alter Rebbe is explaining, why did I say at the beginning of Tanya that the first thing you should try to get is fear? Because if you have fear alone, you're serving God. But if you have love alone, if one studies Torah and performs a commandment with love alone, in order to cleave to him through the study of his Torah and the performance of his commandments, then this is not termed service of a servant. Whereas the Torah has declared, one of the mitzvahs in the Torah is, you shall serve the Lord your God. This verb is cognate with the noun eved, servant, and thus signifies service motivated by the fear and awe of God. And it is likewise written, him shall you serve. As explained in the Zohar, Parshas Bahar, just like the ox on which one places a yoke in order to make it useful to the world, so too must a human being first of all submit to the yoke of the kingdom of heaven and only then engage in divine service. And if this submission is not found in him, holiness cannot rest within him. Because if he only has love and not fear, then he's a yesh, he has ego. And if he is ego, God can't rest there. And elsewhere in Raya Mehemna, which is also part of Zohar, it is written that every man must in his divine service belong to two categories and levels. What are the two categories? Namely, the category of a servant who serves his master out of fear, and the category of a son who serves his father out of love. And although one may find a son who is also a servant, it is impossible to attain to this degree without the prerequisite of the higher level of fear and awe known as Yira Ilah, as is known to the initiated. Okay, we'll skip over this last sentence here for a while. Later, we'll learn more about higher level of fear, lower level of fear. For now, there's actually a story in the Talmud that was it Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? I think it may have been Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who again was the leader of the Jewish people in that time. And there was another great sage, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, that went to study Torah with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's yeshiva. And one day, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's son fell ill, so he asked Rabbi Chanina to pray for his son so that he should live. Reb Chanina, it says, put his head between his knees and prayed. And he prayed and prayed until Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's son became better. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said about Reb Chanina that basically God will listen to whatever he asks, more than me. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's wife heard this and said, really? He's greater than you? So he said, no. But in the court, in God's court, like in God's palace, I'm considered like a minister and he's like a servant. And even though a minister may love the king and be closer to the king may want the minister's presence more. But who does the king respond to in a quicker and more sincere way? To the servant who isn't, not God forbid, a threat to the king, but is a plain servant, is not mixing in his own feelings or his own. Okay. So getting back to fear, we said fear. Why do we need fear? Because fear will lead to obedience, right? Without love itself won't necessarily lead to obedience. Fear will lead to obedience. And if we want to fulfill all of God's commandments, we have to start with fear. But are fear and obedience one and the same? Or is it possible that there could be fear without obedience and obedience without fear?
It's possible.
Yeah, because you might be obedient to somebody because you love them, not because you fear them.
Okay, but it's not. Fear doesn't necessarily have to be a contradiction to love. In other words, someone I love, if I'm scared of hurting them and therefore I'm obedient, that's also fear, even though it's a result of love. The emotion connected to obedience is fear.
Okay.
I don't know if you have obedience that's connected to the emotion of love. You could, but it's a deeper level of love. But does obedience have to be connected to any emotion? Not necessarily, right? You can have a child that the father yells at him to go do something. The child does it. Is it out of obedience or out of fear?
Fear.
Well, it depends. It could be it's out of obedience, but it could very possibly be it's out of fear. And what will happen when he knows his father isn't looking and he won't get caught? He might go and do it. So it's not obedience.
Yeah.
It's fear. And then you have a parent that will tell the child to do something in a very soft-spoken but firm tone. The child knows who's in charge, and the child does it because the parent told him to do it. He may not be scared of his parents at all. Yeah. He may actually go to the parents and ask them, what should I do now? That's not, you wouldn't call that a scared child. Well, no, if a child is scared enough, he might do it out of fear. But you could see a child that, doesn't know what to do now, and he doesn't want to, get caught up in nonsense. So he goes to his parents and says, what can I do now? Give me something to do. That's obedience. So you can have fear. So the Alter Rebbe told us, why do we need fear? Because we need obedience. But wait a second. Do we need fear for obedience? Maybe we could have obedience without fear. So maybe we can have love as the first emotion as long as you have obedience first. Because if you think about it, in divine service, you can also have obedience to God without fear. Most people that Jay described being obedient in morning prayers, he described an element of fear. But there are many people that do it just because they're obedient. They don't necessarily feel an emotion while they're saying it or while they're doing it. For the most part, they go together. In other words, you would expect obedience and fear to go together in some way, but they're not mutually exclusive, right? They could be separated.
But it's almost like those morning prayers are almost like they're inducing fear. Because so many bad things can happen that it's supposedly protecting.
But is it really inducing fear? What about the feeling, looking at it as, look what God's going to protect me from? The average person feels the world is random, and these things can happen. There's nothing in the world that can protect him from it. Here, I have a God that's willing to put his, obviously, that guy's not putting his life, but he's willing to put his neck out for me and protect me from all of these things. That could also create, but we see by nature, you're drawn more towards the element of fear. That's fine. Every person is created differently. Some people are more naturally inclined to the fear side of things. Some people are more naturally inclined to the love side of things. There's actually, I don't know, you might not get there's twice in the Megillah where it says the Ha'ir Shushan, and the city of Shushan was something. The end of chapter 3, it says in the city of Shushan was crying after Haman's decree was put into place. And then later it says, and the city of Shushan, before we say Layudim, Shushan Tzahalav Samecha, was rejoicing and happy. And each one is recited in a different tone. The first one's V'ha'ir Shushan Navoyecha. It's like an Eicha trop. The second one is V'ha'ir Shushan Tzahalav Samecha. We go up in tone. So someone once said they were going down the street, and someone walked by them and said, "I want to give you have you ever gotten an MRI, CAT scan?" He said, "Yeah." "I want to give you a CAT scan right here in the street. If you're a chassid or you're not a chassid." Okay. He said, "Tell me what goes after V'ha'ir Shushan." So he was a little, he wasn't a chassid. He said, "Navaycha," crying. And right when he said that, he realized, he said, if you'd have asked the chassid what comes after that, they would have said, Tzahalav Samecha. No, some people are more inclined to read things and they're looking for the good, the love element in it. And it's neutral. It can be read in both ways. So it's important to identify where we are naturally, because as we'll soon see, a bird with one wing can't fly. And most of us have one wing, either love or fear. Most of us innately have that. In order for us to fly, what we really have to do is work on the one we're lacking. And that's the more difficult one to work on because that's against our nature.
So
but we'll see that in a moment.
Does that mean that once you not mastered, maybe it's not the right term, have love and fear, then you have kavana?
Yeah.
That's because now you have two wings, you can rise up.
When you have love and fear, then it's not just you have kavana for this particular mitzvah. Your whole life is a life of kavana. Now, every moment of your life, you're living for God. Even when you're sleeping, when you're eating, when you're showering, when you're going out for a walk, when you're exercising, when you're working, whatever it is you're doing, because you're in love with God and you're fearful of God, now every action, every thought, and every speech, every word you speak is going to be thought through. Because what are you really thinking about? You're thinking about God. That's the opening verse of Tanya. This is very near to you, that it should be in your heart and in your mouth to do it constantly, 24/7.
But if you have fear and you have love, people can have fear and love and have nothing to do with God.
Okay, everyone has fear and love. That's the point, to channel it, to create a fear and love of God, of course. That's why you meditate about God instead of meditating about pizza. You meditate about pizza, you're going to like pizza. Or you're going to fear pizza because you realize how much you love it and how much you're going to eat it, how sick it's going to make you. Okay, but so we have to train ourselves. The Alter Rebbe starts, as we said last week, start with a few minutes a day at the beginning of the day. Start meditating about God. Start thinking more about God. The more you think about something, the more in love you become with it. The more you think about it, the more infatuated you become with it, the more it consumes your life. We want to be infatuated. We want to drown in godliness. It's very hard to move 180 degrees from a world focused on our body and animal soul to a world focused on our godly soul. That's the process of turning around the ship. Okay, so in Kabbalah, by the way, fear is gevura, right? That's the left-hand side. Obedience is malchus, royalty. That's the king. That's the last sphera, is malchus. That's obedience, because obedience can be an inclusion of both love and fear, or It's not exclusive to fear. Why do we want to separate obedience from fear? So we mentioned at the beginning of the class today, is it possible to meditate and try to create a fear of God and actually not be in fear? It is. It's possible to create this sort of intellectual fear. By the way, in the Torah, there are two words that are used to express fear. Do you know any of the two words in Hebrew, in the Torah, in biblical Hebrew, that are used to express fear? Huh? Yira is one, yes. There's another word that's used to express fear. Pachad. Pachad.
Pachad?
Yeah. Pachad also means fear, but if you use the way Rashi translates it, pachad would be more than fear, it would be fright. Like frightened. What would you think is the difference between fear and fright? When would you say or first of all, which one is a stronger emotion? Being fearful or being frightened? Frightened. When do you think you transition from fear to fright?
When you understand.
Maybe when it's right in front of you.
Oh, so Rashi says fear is something in the distance. Okay. Almost every person is scared of tigers. But are you frightened of tigers? No, because they're behind a cage. But when you see a tiger in front of you and there's no cage separating,
then you might be.
Fear, intellectual fear, is more like yira. It's a fear from a distance. I know to be scared. My heart isn't beating faster. I'm not actually feeling an emotion of being scared, of fear. But intellectually, I have that emotion. It is called, in Kabbalah, it's called an intellectual emotion. So it is an emotion, but it's only in the head. It hasn't translated. I don't feel anything different in my body.
In Kaufman?
No, it would probably be in Das. Das, but it's and if anything, it would be Bina because it's the left side. Because fear is on the left side, Bina is on the left side. But no, it'd probably be more in Das. Das is the seat, the back of the brain, the seat of the emotions in the brain. Whereas Pachad would be more fear that's an emotion. And at the beginning of class today, we discussed that if you only have fear in the mind, it didn't become an emotion, it's still considered service of God, yeah? What about if I don't even feel fear in my head? I may even know I should be afraid, but even intellectually, I'm not afraid. You have people that know a tiger can tear them apart, but they know they shouldn't go close, but they're just not afraid.
I feel like young kids would do that.
But the young child knows that's going to burn them by touching that.
But let's say they don't know. They know it. You told them about it, but until they actually experience it, sometimes they don't really know it. They don't even know it in their head.
They're still going to touch it.
Right.
You tell them not to.
So at the beginning of class, we said, if you've meditated all the things that will lead to fear, but it didn't lead to a palpable fear in the heart, that's still considered divine service. Don't worry, you still did something good. What about if you meditated the whole day and you didn't even create an intellectual fear? Was that also considered divine service?
Yes.
That's why the Alter Rebbe here is separating between fear and obedience. Because the Alter Rebbe is saying that why is fear the first emotion to work on? Not because of the emotion of fear, but because usually the emotion of fear is tied to obedience. So that's why the Alter Rebbe says fear comes first, but really what's first? Obedience. So if you find yourself incapable of creating fear, don't worry. Create obedience. And obedience can be gotten through pure intellect. if you're not scared of the principal at school and you're not scared of your parents, but you want to be in school, you're going to be obedient. Even though you're not fearful, you want to go to school. You want to do all the craziest things in the world. You also want to be in school, whether it's to be with your friends or even to learn. You may want to learn. You may also want to harass people and drive people crazy. But you know that if you drive people crazy, you're not going to be in school. So you're going to be obedient, even though you couldn't care less what other people think. You have zero fear. So it is possible to think about God in a way that will create obedience without actually creating the emotion of fear. Now, most people can create a fear, at least intellectually. That's why that's the best place to start. But the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us now that even if you can't get to the emotion of fear, you can separate between fear and obedience, at least deal with obedience.
But, it's like, and I keep using the same example because I know it, but when you start doing your morning prayers, it's more like I'm obedient. I'm supposed to do these. But it's after doing them for a while and understanding what they're saying.
That's great. Emotions are better.
Fear comes about.
Emotions are good to create. Sometimes emotions can be created through routine, through consistency, but more likely it's prolonged, consistent meditation. When you said your morning prayers for months on end, and you thought about what you said every day, at a certain point, it led you to fear. You grew from a dry, cold existence of just doing it because this is what I'm supposed to do. Now you actually feel something. Okay, you're feeling a very basic level of fear. You don't want to serve God because you're worried what God's going to do if you don't serve him. Fine, but at least you're starting to have emotions towards God. That's a good place to start. Remember, when you're looking for a spouse, you don't want to have to spend years developing emotions. Okay, you want to be able to have feelings for the person. Here, you're not looking for a spouse. You know you want to be in a relationship with God. Now work on that relationship. Someone wakes up after they get married and they realize they're not in love with their spouse. So in American society, what do? You divorced. Let's say divorce isn't an option. And it doesn't have to be religiously. You know, if you work on this hard enough, and then if you get divorced and marry someone else, you'll have the same issue. Yeah, you'll get bored after a while. So what do? When you know there's no other option? So now you're going to spend years working on creating emotions. And it's possible. Unless the person is an evil person, obviously, which is 9.9 times out of 10 not the case. 99% of the time, you can, I shouldn't say 99% of the time, an overwhelming majority of the time, if there was no other option, you'd figure out to make a life with this person. It's a lot of work. But with God, there is no other alternative. There is no other option. Fine. It took you months to create an emotion, a very basic emotion. Beautiful. I think that's a lot better than a lot of other people. But when you continue doing it for months with the same emotion, soon that emotion will grow. It'll graduate to a higher level of awe, into a love. When you'll start reading it, see, I gave you a different perspective to look at it today. The more you think about that perspective, you may actually develop a desire, a passion about doing it. You may not. But this is how we grow. Okay, let's look a little inside here. On page 608. Furthermore, even in the case of an individual, even in his mind and thought, feels no fear or shame on account of the limited grade of his soul, originating in the lower degrees of the 10 Sefirot of Asiya. In other words, he's incapable of meditating about God, of his soul having such a clear vision that it actually is influenced by this and gets emotional. Nevertheless, since he is intent in his service to serve the king, this is unequivocally a complete service. In other words, he's obedient. He wants to serve God to the fullest. This is a complete service. For fear and service are accounted as two commandments of the total of 613, and they do not exclude each other. There is a mitzvah to fear God. there's also a mitzvah to serve God. And although the Alter Rebbe said that the foundation of service is fear, but when it boils down to it, it's actually two separate things. Usually, fear comes together with obedience, which leads to service. But if fear is separate, that's fine. It's a separate mitzvah. At least fulfill the mitzvah of obedience, of serving God. Then you'll work on the mitzvah of fearing God. There was once a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. We mentioned before from the Machzor of Shlomo of Karlin. He was also a colleague of the Alter Rebbe, but they took very different paths. After the Maggid of Mezritch died, there was no one successor. And all of his 120 students led their own communities. And Reb Shlomo of Karlin was not just, most of the students went their own way. Reb Shlomo of Karlin had a lot of problems with the Alter Rebbe. There was a lot of politics, spiritual politics between the two. It once happened that one of the big chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, Reb Zalman Zezmer, once happened to travel with Reb Shlomo of Karlin. So with the arch opponent, so to speak, again, they were holy people, but spiritual of the Alter Rebbe, and they were traveling. And on the way, he saw how Reb Shlomo conducted himself and how he was davening and how he was doing mitzvahs and even some miracles along the way. And then he ended up being in his city in Karlin, in Shlomo of Karlin's city for Shabbos, and he saw the way, and he was very in awe of Reb Shlomo's holiness. After Shabbos, Reb Shlomo asked him to maybe come be my chassid. And Reb Zalman wasn't confused, but he didn't know what to do until he blurted out. He said, I think what was then considered like Ukrainian, Polish type of language. I don't remember the word, but the point was, the master is a master, but not mine. The servant is a servant, but not yours. In other words, even though Reb Zalman felt emotion towards Reb Shlomo of Karlin, but in obedience, he was obedient to the Alter Rebbe. He was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, and he recognized the difference. So let's say a person, they're more afraid of what their peers think about them than their parents. But if a child is obedient, he will be able to do the right thing, even though he's more afraid of the opinion of his peers than of the punishment of his parents. So what's even more important than fear is obedience. Again, many times they come together, and it's best to bring them together because then you have emotions on your side. It's easier to follow through. But if you can't have fear, obedience is enough, because if you have obedience and you want to do the right thing, then you're guaranteed you will do the right thing. Whereas fear without obedience doesn't guarantee anything. The minute your father isn't looking, the minute you're not thinking about the morning prayers, all bets are off. Oh, I didn't realize the time. Okay, I think we'll stop here. So we're at 6:08, right? Yeah, okay.
Top of 6.
Top of 6:09, yes. Perfect.
Okay, this is gonna be